Welcome. Tonight we have another non-Lady Night Terror story, so thank you very much to the author for permission to read it. The name of this one is simply Grandpa's Story. My grandfather told me a story when I was just a little kid about a woman who used to roam the woods behind our house in the dead of night. Of course, this was no ordinary woman. It was a wraith who would patrol the darkness after midnight and who would snatch the breath of anyone unlucky enough to meet up with her. Now, as a young kid, hearing such a tale from the grandfather you loved and respected established a deep fear within me that ensured I would never set foot anywhere close to the woods after dark. And as I grew into adulthood, I realized that this was probably the real intent of my grandfather after all. The roving spirit was said to be clad in a white gown, apparently the preferred color of the ghostly, except for a black scarf wound around her head, which was said to cast her face into shadow, allowing only her white dog-like teeth to stand out from the cavern of her mouth. Young men were particularly vulnerable to this demon, and any of them who went missing was naturally assumed to have fallen victim to her. Although, if I throw my mind back, there was only ever one person who had disappeared in the 16 years that I lived in my grandfather's house, and he was a known drunk. You would hear her cackle, Grandpa warned, and then he would start gagging as she would steal your very breath, watching you slowly suffocate as she laughed and laughed, and when you were dead, she would drag your remains away to feast on it or to use your bones to make charms. Oh, she was a witch? I once asked, to which he replied, with a bit of exasperation, witch, demon, ghost, call it what you will. It's all the same, boy. She is evil. Evil incarnate. What's incarnate? I wondered, while at the same time thinking that they were not, in fact, all the same, but kept that to myself, since he already seemed a bit annoyed with my inquiries. Of course, I heard this story more than once, although each time he told it to my sister and me, it always seemed to develop new terrors and plots and twists, especially if my cousins were visiting. I was 8 at the time, and my sister was 6. My cousins were all around my age or younger. If the intent was to keep me out of the woods, then Grandpa's story worked. Whenever it got dark, I would always ensure that I kept as close to the house as possible, unless there was an adult with me. And even then I would stare off into the darkness of the trees, with innate terror bubbling in my chest, drawing scant comfort from the fact that this demon witch ghost lady was only said to emerge after midnight, by which time I would be well tucked away in bed. While the front of our house faced the main road, at the back it sloped down for about 50 feet to a narrow valley, where Grandpa kept his garden, and from where would come the produce for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The garden was about 50 feet wide and about 100 feet long, and on the other side, it would start sloping upward again, maybe for about 200 feet, where the tree line would begin and grow thicker the deeper you went in. It got to be about 250 feet at its highest, and then the land would undulate into valleys and hills, much of which was covered in brush and woodland. As I grew older, this area became a favorite playground for my friends and me, and we would be off into the woods to catch fish from the streams that ran through it, pick fruit, or play gangsters. Gangsters was my favorite game, and we'd divide into 2 groups and scatter throughout the woods, where we would hide and use branches for guns, trying to ambush and shoot out the other guys. This game, of course, depended on a high level of honesty from those who had been shot, and required them to concede. But since this was a much more innocent time, most of us gave up when we were caught, although there was the occasional argument about who was shot first. Despite all of the fun we would have in the woods, as dusk approached, we would all hustle back to our homes. I wasn't the only one whose parents or grandparents regaled them with stories of monsters and ghouls in the thicket. But as any smart person knows, those things can only exist after dark. So we were comfortable in our youthful naivety of making and holding firm to that distinction. If you are wondering whether some scary episode occurred that proved my grandpa right, then I'm sorry to disappoint you, but none did. Well, at least, nothing happened when I was a kid. It would be many years later, long after Grandpa had died, and I had grown up to have kids of my own, that this terrifying story would once again be fresh in my mind. I left my grandparents' home when I was 16, going on 17, and while I would frequently visit, there was one occasion that I found myself in the house all alone. This would have been about 20 years after I stopped living there. Over the decades, many of my uncles and aunts had gotten married and bought homes of their own, with a couple even migrating. By the time both of my grandparents passed away, only my Uncle John still lived in the house. John was a career bachelor, and so lived alone. Sadly, John was a heavy drinker, which led to organ failure when he was just 55. Even though I had always been particularly close to John, he had been ailing for some time, so his death did not take me by surprise, and I was with him at the hospital the night he died. Now, my family and I lived about a 2.5-hour drive from the area where John lived. Meantime, Grandpa's house, or John's house now, was just a 15-minute drive away from the hospital. By the time I wrapped up at the hospital, and the attendants had taken away John's body, it was already around 1 a.m., and after chatting with my wife on the phone, she suggested I just sleep over at the house, and she and the kids would drive down tomorrow. I agreed, and arrived at the house around 1:30 a.m. Everything was in pitch darkness, and as I locked my car and walked from the driveway to the front door, I was suddenly transported 30 years back in time, and I felt that childish fear reach out with cold fingers, grabbing onto my stomach and caressing my back. I involuntarily shivered, but then laughed a bit, and was quickly an adult with a job and 2 great kids once more. I opened the door, flipped on the lights, and headed for the back bedroom, which was the one I used to sleep in as a kid. There were 4 bedrooms in all. I hit the bed and was out, like the proverbial light. Less than a half an hour later, I shot up in bed, not sure what had awoken me. I knew how much time had passed, since the first thing I did was glance at the clock. 1:59 a.m., the green LED readout informed me. Come on, I thought to myself. You're much too old to be acting like a kid. Figuring it was just the stress of John's death and tiredness that was getting the best of me. I lay down and made myself comfortable before once more closing my eyes. And that's when I heard it. It was a moan. Actually, it was more like a wail. It was a woman's voice. And although it seemed low and mournful, I heard it clearly. My eyes flew open, and I felt the hairs on my body stand on end. The sound was coming from the back of the house. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. And the child in me said, "I'm staying right where I am. None of this crap for me." And I wished to God that I had heeded my own advice. But I was an adult after all, not some gullible kid. And as the moaning continued, every couple of minutes or so it seemed to draw even closer. My rational mind started playing out different, more realistic scenarios in my head. I had neighbors, people who lived on either side of the house, and I know that at least one of those families had an elderly woman living with them. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the lady suffered from dementia, and all the problems that went with that. As this thought developed in my mind, so did my confidence, and I genuinely started wondering if maybe this was that old lady who, in her mental state, may have walked out of the house while her family slept. It was late after all. Okay, I resolved that at least I needed to take a look. And if, as unlikely as it might be, it was in fact old Miss Jenny from next door, only then would I go out and fetch her. So I slipped out of bed and snuck over to the window, trying to be as quiet as I could. The windows in the house must have been decades old themselves, and were still made of glass loose. A thick curtain covered the window, for which I was grateful since no one could see me from the outside, even though I was on the second floor. I did not switch on any lights. Very slowly, I pushed aside just a tiny bit of curtain to the left of the window and peeked outside. It was sheer darkness, with only a faint glimmer from the streetlights casting any illumination. My eyes did not take long to adjust to the darkness, since I had been sleeping in a dark room just moments before, and soon I could start making things out. My Uncle John did not share Grandpa's passion for gardening, and I could see that where there were neatly laid out vegetable beds and trees before, there was now a heavy undergrowth, creeping up to within 10 feet of the back of the house. "Oh, wow, John. If Grandpa saw this, he'd have your head," I thought, and smiled a bit. Then I heard it, and my smile dissipated. It sounded like it was coming from inside the brush, not too far from the window, but I strained to make out anything in the dark. "That's you, Miss Jenny. Then you are going to be in a world of hurt," I whispered, as I imagined the thorns and sharp branches that made up the undergrowth. But barely had the words left my lips, I was sure I saw movement. Wait. Yes, there was someone in there. Oh no. If this was that old lady, she could be hurt. So I stood up and pulled the curtain open, wide enough that someone looking up would know that someone was looking down. And that was when she stepped out of the undergrowth. It was not Miss Jenny. I felt my throat constrict and my breathing grow ragged. Perspiration instantly burst from my face. There was an icy, tingling feeling in my stomach. I was sure my bladder malfunctioned, and I remember having the most absurd thought. So people's knees really do knock, like in the cartoons after all. As all the strength left my legs, causing them to bump together. It was a woman. But a woman clad in a gown, which may have been white at one time, but which was now smeared with dirt, and I hesitate to imagine what else. I could not see her face. She was staring at the ground, and a black cloth was wrapped around her head. That was when the moaning stopped, and the cackling began, just as Grandpa had told me all those years ago. It sounded like not one, but a chorus of women, deep and scornful, and as she laughed, Slowly, the apparition, the demon, the witch, whatever this was, started to raise its head to look at me. I could not move. I wanted to. I wanted to yank back the curtain and dash under my bed. I wanted to turn on all the lights of the house. I wanted to make a run for the car and get the hell out of there. I wanted to do all of those things. But I did nothing. Transfixed, I stood watching as her head rose, slowly but deliberately. And then it was looking at me. I knew it. I felt it in every sinew, every nerve, and every fiber of my being. But I could not see her face. It was hidden by the black scarf. There was just darkness, and I was left to wonder what manner of malevolence was staring at me. And then it smiled. That smile broke my paralysis. That smile stood out from the darkness of where the face should be. White, canine teeth. And suddenly the cackling was replaced by laughter, a piercing, evil sound. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I could not look away. Terror overwhelmed me as I suddenly realized I couldn't breathe. I gasped for air with both hands grasped at my throat, which might well have saved my life. As I reached for my throat, I let go of the curtain, causing it to fall back into place, covering the window, hiding the devilish creature that stood just below my window. But I could still hear its sinister laughter, and still I could not breathe. Stars swarmed before my eyes until at last, I think I passed out. I sat up in a rush, sending myself tumbling off the bed and knocking my head. My chest hurt, and my eyes stung as if I had been crying. I looked around in terror, but all that greeted me was bright sunlight shining through tiny slits in the curtain covering the windows, and the melodic singing of the finches that were popular in this area. I rubbed at where I hit my head, all the terror from earlier suddenly punching me in the gut, and I took a deep breath. I could breathe. I gave a small, nervous laugh. I had been on the bed when I awoke, and all else seemed normal. Did I dream that? I must have, I thought, as I warily glanced across at the window, which was still closed and covered by the curtain. I slowly stood up. I felt dizzy and hoped that I had not given myself a concussion, and gingerly made my way across to the window. I hesitated, but the daylight and the sounds of birds and the chirping of other insects comforted me a bit, and I yanked the curtain open wide. All was normal. It was a beautiful day. The sunlight flooded the back of the house, and I saw birds and butterflies dancing and fluttering among the greenery of the trees. The sky above was bright blue with puffy clouds being carried along by the wind, and I fondly remembered why I had loved this place so much when I was a child. The garden was indeed overgrown, but that was to be expected, and I had just about convinced myself that I did indeed have a terrible nightmare when I saw them. My blood ran cold. There, in the soft earth beneath my window, were footprints leading from the bushes and ending just where I had seen that nightmare creature. But these were no ordinary footprints. No, these looked like they were made by extremely large hooves. The end.